Welcome back to Grimverse History, where we uncover the strange and forgotten sides of history. Tonight, we'll uncover one of the darkest chapters of ancient Rome, the reign of Emperor Caligula, who turned the empire into his private theater of worship and desire. This is the story of 5 erotic atrocities that transformed faith into fear and pleasure into policy. They called him the savior of Rome, the young emperor who promised mercy after years of tyranny. Crowds shouted his name, women threw petals in his path, and senators bowed with trembling hope. But hope can curdle fast. After one mysterious illness, mercy became mockery. Statues of gods were torn down and replaced with his own face. Husbands were ordered to applaud as their wives were taken. Fathers auctioned the purity of their daughters, not for coin, but for survival. Rome had seen wars, betrayals, assassins, but never this. A bureaucracy of lust. A government where every desire had a document, every act a fee, and every scream an entry number. You can almost hear it. The faint scratch of stylus on wax tablets, the scent of perfume over blood, the quiet laughter of men who no longer sounded human. Take a deep breath. Let the noise of your day fade away. You're safe here, only a witness to time. If you enjoy exploring the darker corners of history, don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and leave a like to help others find their way into the shadows with us. Now, dim the lights. Let the hum of your fan become your heartbeat. Slow your thoughts. You're not watching, you're remembering. It's the year 37 AD. The empire still feasts. The Senate still cheers. And somewhere in the glittering palace, a young man smiles at his reflection, unaware, or perhaps fully aware, that Rome's descent has already begun. Now we descend into that abyss, to uncover the 5 sexual atrocities that defined Emperor Caligula. You can almost hear the marble breathe. Rome, for once, is quiet. The statues along the forum still glitter with morning dew, and the air carries the faint smell of olive oil and dust. After years of Tiberius, the old spider who ruled from a distant island, people are starving for something human. They want a smile, a young face, someone who looks like he might actually touch the ground he walks on. Enter Caligula. The crowd calls him the Little Boots, a nickname born from the tiny soldier sandals he wore as a child on military campaigns with his father, Germanicus. To Rome, Germanicus was everything Tiberius wasn't: noble, brave, beloved. When Germanicus died, poison or politics or both, the people mourned him as if Jupiter himself had fallen from the sky. So when his son takes the throne, they think the gods have corrected their mistake. The Senate sighs in relief. The guards cheer. Even the slaves whisper, maybe this time, maybe it will be different. And for a short while, it is. The corridors of Caligula's palace didn't echo with political debates. They echoed with people begging for mercy. Under his rule, Rome's elite discovered a new category of terror, a terror where fathers were pushed to auction away the purity of their own daughters, and husbands were forced to cheer, while their wives were humiliated as if it was some twisted stage show. His ascent to power was welcomed like a miracle. People celebrated for a full 100 days. To the crowds, he represented the continuation of a legendary dynasty. Nobody imagined that this charismatic, well-educated, charming young man would become the mastermind behind the most structured system of moral corruption Rome would ever witness. His early years were a blend of privilege and trauma. He was raised among soldiers, revered by the legions who worshipped his father. But he also witnessed the darker side of imperial politics, the suspicious death of Germanicus, likely through poison, and the destruction of his own family. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was exiled. His older brothers were executed or locked away. Caligula survived by playing a role, harmless, foolish, non-threatening. Growing up in Tiberius's palace taught him a critical lesson. In Rome, survival depended on deception, and he became a master at pretending. When he first took the throne, everything looked promising. He cut taxes, released political prisoners, put on spectacular public games, improved infrastructure, built aqueducts, repaired major roads, and rewarded the legions. Rome adored him. Women scattered flowers in his path. Children sang songs praising him. Senators, the same men who would later tremble at hearing his footsteps, fought for moments of his attention. It felt like Rome's golden age had finally arrived after years trapped under Tiberius's fear-driven rule. The difference was astonishing. Where Tiberius isolated himself on Capri, Caligula walked openly among the people, joined public celebrations, and even shared meals with senators. He appeared approachable, generous, and almost divine in his popularity. Then, everything changed. In the autumn of 37, a mysterious illness struck him down. He spent weeks on the brink of death. No one knows what it is. Maybe poison, maybe infection, maybe divine joke. One night he burns with fever. The palace locks its gates. The next morning, Rome holds its breath. Court doctors documented fevers hotter than they thought a human could survive. Violent convulsions that required multiple men to hold him still, and delirious episodes where he claimed he was speaking directly with Jupiter himself. Rome was paralyzed with fear. Weeks pass. Priests sacrifice every animal they can find. The temples smell of blood and incense. Senators send prayers. Poets write hymns. The empire becomes a waiting room. And then, against every whisper of doubt, he rises. But something doesn't come back with him. His eyes still shine, but the warmth behind them is gone. The smile remains, yet it no longer reaches the skin. At first, they call it divine inspiration, then divine confusion. Finally, divine madness. The palace smells of oil and stone. Somewhere, a torch hisses softly, the kind of sound that only exists when everyone else is asleep. He survived his illness, but something stayed behind in the fever. Maybe it was a fragment of that burning night, a whisper that told him he didn't just cheat death. He replaced it. Priests sacrificed endlessly to the gods. Some citizens vowed their own lives if it meant saving the emperor. And when he finally opened his eyes, something fundamental inside him was different. The first sign was almost subtle. He commanded that every statue of every god in Rome should have its head replaced with his own likeness. Overnight, Jupiter, Neptune, Apollo, all begin to look suspiciously familiar. Caligula's profile blooms across Rome like a rash of marble. It was the foundation for his descent into something much darker. It started within his own household with his sisters Drusilla, Julia Livilla, and Agrena the Younger. They were no longer just his family. They became the first victims of what would turn into a state policy. His fixation on Drusilla was the most extreme. He called her his Diana. He treated her as if she were his empress in public events, seating her in places reserved only for imperial wives. When Drusilla died in 38, Caligula spiraled into a frantic rage. He ordered an official mourning period, so strict that laughter, bathing, and even family meals were forbidden. Anyone who displayed happiness was executed. But his grief wasn't love. It was the fury of someone who felt his ownership had been stolen by death itself. With Drusilla gone, his attention shifted to his remaining sisters, and then to the daughters and wives of Rome's elite. This is where the system truly began. Caligula forced noble women to participate in acts with senators. While he observed from a specially crafted golden throne, taking notes on who seemed eager, who hesitated, and who simply tried to be polite. These notes were later used as political leverage. A senator who behaved enthusiastically toward Julia Livilla suddenly began supporting every imperial order without question. Another who showed reluctance found his young son missing, and days later returned to him harmed forever, castrated as a warning. The signal was unmistakable. In Caligula's Rome, neutrality didn't exist. Everyone could be turned into either an offender or a victim, often both. Roman physician Lucius Scriba left behind writings hidden for centuries in a villa near Pompeii, detailing how Caligula forced him to examine noble women and girls, assessing their fertility and their ability to endure repeated use. He begins to blur the line between worship and command. The empire becomes his stage, and every order a performance. He summons noblemen's wives for rituals. He calls senators by the names of gods, only to mock them later for believing it. There's method in the madness and madness in the method. Rome learns a new rule that day, never outtalk the emperor and never outshine his quiet. The palace staff whisper about his walks, long, aimless circuits through the gardens, naked, body slick with oil against the chill. He moves through the hedges like a ghost that refuses to haunt anyone in particular. Sometimes he stops and kneels in the dirt, pressing his ear to the ground, saying he can hear the gods breathing. If madness has a rhythm, it's the slow heartbeat of someone listening for something that isn't there. There's a sound that doesn't belong in a palace, the quiet scratching of a stylus on wax, the shuffle of parchment, the sigh of a clerk calculating divine pleasure. It begins as an idea, or perhaps as an infection, that finally learns to organize itself. Caligula calls it worship. Rome calls it administration. And somewhere between those two words, something human disappears. The palace is no longer just marble and echo. It breathes now, like an organism, veins of corridors, heartbeats of rooms. Each one has a name: Jupiter, Venus, Priapus, the gods, demoted to signage. Inside the Venus room, the air is heavy with oil and fear. Curtains the color of dried blood hang from bronze hooks. A clerk waits in the corner, reed pen in hand, eyes averted. He is here not to see, but to record. Every movement, every tremor has a number, every name a column, every act an entry. Duration, payment, reaction, all part of the paperwork. The empire that once measured land now measures flesh. There's a department for pleasure, another for punishment. A priest who blesses each act. A physician who ensures no one dies too early. Death is expensive. A treasurer who counts the offerings. These examinations were humiliating, performed in front of the emperor himself, who asked invasive, degrading questions about each woman's body. This wasn't spontaneous cruelty. It was organized, bureaucratic, executed with the same precision as a census. Rates and fees were standardized. Caligula had transformed personal depravity into a government structure, a machine designed to crush dignity, eliminate resistance, and turn Rome's nobility into obedient instruments of his power. 16 tercios for a night with a senator's wife, 2,000 for his virgin daughter, 5,000 if he wanted both, at once. The payments didn't disappear into private pockets. They were lobbed straight into the imperial treasury, dressed up as voluntary contributions for the good of the state. The palace itself became what Caligula insisted on calling a temple of divine service, and he meant it literally. This was no metaphorical rebranding. He refitted rooms, corridors, and rituals to function like a sacramental machine. Each chamber had a name and a function. Each chamber had its own scent: myrrh, sweat, burned oil. The smell clings to clothes and follows people into their dreams. Rome begins to reek of ritual. There was the room of Jupiter, a space used for the emperor's ritualized abuses, where he cast himself as a living god and bestowed his favors. There was the chamber of Venus, staged for enforced ceremonies that forced noble matrons into recreations of mythic scenes. There was even a hall associated with Priapus, where acts of humiliation were carried out against those the emperor chose. Caligula commissioned lavish frescoes to decorate these spaces. The Travertine halls that had once hosted debates about war and law now echoed to very different sounds. And the men who had built Rome, the senators, were made to walk those same corridors, to hear what happened and remain silent. The system was intricate beyond imagination. First in the chain were senators' wives drafted into what the emperor called the imperial cult. They followed schedules, wore designated uniforms, sheer Syrian silks so fine they were virtually ceremonial, and performed rituals according to strict timetables. Next came daughters. Girls as young as 12 were eased into the regimen under the pretense of divine instruction. But Caligula didn't stop at humiliation. A set of secret memos describe what amounted to a program of selective breeding. Women judged most fertile were compelled to bear children destined to be raised as imperial dependents. Children separated from their fathers and trained from infancy to serve court needs. Every conception, every birth, every infant death was noted in the ledgers. It starts quietly. It always does. The empire has learned to whisper. Paper rustles, pens scrape, signatures bloom in neat rows. Every signature means the same thing: consent. Rome begins to legalize its own degradation, one trembling hand at a time. In Caligula's court, humiliation isn't chaos, it's law. And law, when dressed in marble and ink, looks respectable. The new decree arrives in gold lettering. It declares that the emperor's body is sacred, not metaphorically, but literally. To touch him, to serve him, to please him, is to serve the gods. Refusal, therefore, becomes blasphemy. He summons noble families to the palace, fathers with quills, mothers with pearls, sons with shaky smiles. The documents are long, polite, and final. Each begins with the same phrase: I, of my own free will. He watches them sign. Some do it quickly, others hesitate, eyes flicking toward their daughters standing beside them in silk. The silence stretches until the pen moves again. Ink doesn't scream. The city adjusts again. Temples echo with softer prayers. The Senate invents new titles to disguise its fear. Words like divine favor and ritual privilege become currency. People trade dignity the way merchants trade spices. He invents new rituals, some cruel, some absurd. He tells senators to praise him while crawling. He commands generals to sing hymns naked under the moon. There's laughter at first, forced, hollow. Then there isn't. Even the guards begin to avert their eyes, not from modesty, but from exhaustion. It's hard to keep pretending you don't see what everyone sees. He introduces a new project. He calls it the Divine Lineage Initiative. No one knows what that means until the letters go out. The women of the court, wives, widows, and daughters of senators, are chosen to bear children for the empire. Their offspring will be raised as imperial property, bred for loyalty. Rome, which once mapped the world, now maps its own bloodlines. Some women vanish behind palace walls, returning months later hollow-eyed and silent. Some never return. The rest of Rome learns to stop asking. The less you know, the longer you live. Every morning, scribes deliver lists, names written in careful cursive, age, lineage, family connection. It looks like census data. It isn't. The emperor receives them during breakfast, his fingers tracing down the parchment as if choosing from a menu. No one speaks while he reads. When he points, a quiet nod sends runners through the palace. Somewhere, a household freezes. Somewhere else, a family begins to pray. He schedules the process like a ritual. At dusk, the palace glows with lamplight. The chosen are brought in, faces veiled, silence enforced. He speaks of divine duty, of Rome's future, of blood that must continue. His voice is calm, the tone of a man convinced that destiny is administrative. No one dares call it what it is. On paper, it's devotion. In reality, it's the empire breeding its own fear. Each day repeats the same pattern: petitions, approvals, ceremonies. He calls them ceremonies to make them sound clean. The clerks note attendance. The physicians supervise. The guards ensure the cycle never stops. There is no beginning or end, only a constant rotation. Rumors say he keeps ledgers to track the outcomes, names, dates, predictions of birth, the bureaucracy of godhood, perfected. If a woman bears a child, the record reads fulfilled. If not, it simply reads reassigned. In his mind, this is order. The empire's lifeblood, bottled and counted. Rome is no longer a city of men. It is his reflection multiplied. No one knows how many are chosen each day. Some say dozens, others whisper hundreds. Numbers blur when fear becomes routine. Many pregnancies ended in desperate attempts to prevent childbirth, a grim statistic recorded by scribes. Men were also not exempt. Caligula ordered the feminization of the sons of patrician houses, dressing them in diaphanous saffron tunics, painting their faces with white lead and vermilion, teaching them to move and gesture in ways he found pleasing. The emperor, in a moment of what he calls balance, begins to feminize his courtiers. They are dressed in silk, painted in rouge, displayed like relics. He laughs, claps, tells them they look divine. These boys were paraded at banquets and auctioned for the night. The emperor's involvement was rarely about desire. It was about domination. Each act, each public violation was a deliberate political statement. Nothing is sacred that I cannot defile. No tradition is safe from my touch. No family is immune from collapse. Perhaps the most savage innovation was how he enlisted families in their own ruin. Many parents were forced not just to witness, but to collude. Torchbearers in processions, signatories on contracts consenting to the service of their wives and daughters. The Senate was pressed to pass laws that cloaked abuse with religious legitimacy. One such statute declared the emperor's body sacred, framing any union with him as a form of worship. It was legal architecture built to sanctify the emperor's violations. Caligula discovered a cruelty beyond physical force, coercive complicity. He didn't only attack families from the outside, he turned them into instruments of their own destruction. Senator Cornelius is a case in point. When summoned to hand over his wife Libya, he stood up in the Senate and refused. It was a public act of defiance, brave but fatal in its consequences. The next morning, Cornelius's 8-year-old son was discovered on the Senate steps, mutilated, alive, and bearing an unmistakable message carved into his flesh. The warning worked. That afternoon, Cornelius delivered Libya to the emperor. Months later, when she conceived by imperial decree, Cornelius was forced to recognize the child as the legitimate heir, abandoning any claims from his other offspring. Humiliation was made law. The Senate voted unanimously that any child of the emperor of whatever origin outranked sons born in lawful marriages, and when the moon is full, he auctions them off. The crowd cheers because the crowd must cheer. Gold changes hands. The empire learns a new economy, one built on the sale of obedience. Running this apparatus required an administration that rivaled Rome's civil government. Hidden clerks kept meticulous registers in a sealed archive beneath the Palatine. Each file followed a template: victim's name, age, social rank, physical description, acts performed, duration, degree of apparent cooperation, resulting pregnancies, fees paid, physicians who examined the women, records of injury or illness, midwives present at forced births, guards who escorted them on set schedules, and accountants who tallied revenues. Yes, the emperor charged for these services, and the proceeds flowed into imperial coffers. Hundreds of people became cogs in this machine. There were prosecutors of propriety, caretakers of ritual clothing, official midwives, the scribes who wrote the lists, guards who enforced the timetables, and accountants who balanced the books. The dispersion of responsibility made it easier for individuals to avoid moral ownership. Nobody stood alone as the monster. Everyone could claim they were merely fulfilling a role. Certain nights were ritualized as spectacles. Full moons were prime time. Caligula staged lunar fertility rites in a converted private amphitheater, turning it into a staged pagan temple. He arranged matches with carefully selected participants. Gladiators famed for their vigor, Nubian captives brought from the empire's frontiers, even animals on occasion, creatures like trained bears or Molosian mastiffs, and once a leopard presented as a royal gift. Husbands sat in the galleries in their senatorial togas, forced to maintain composure while their wives were degraded below them. The emperor orchestrated every detail like a ringmaster, deciding pairings, numbers, duration, even body positioning, using a gilded baton topped with phallic symbols to indicate his choices. Scribes documented everything: names, events, timings, and notably performative episodes. What played out was less chaos than a theater of dominance, an institution where human suffering was converted into pageantry and then commodified. An entire shadow economy grew up around the palace's needs. Vendors sold ointments and eye washes claimed to ease pain. Clandestine apothecaries supplied abortions. Tutors taught young survivors how to mimic compliance. Doctors opened practices focused on repair and reconstruction. Everyone who touched the system charged a fee. Everyone who touched it profited. And that profit is what made it so durable. Greed lubricated complicity. Vanity, fear, ambition, all became incentives to look away, to obey, to participate. The horror was not simply that Caligula could commit atrocities. It was that he engineered a society where atrocity paid. All of Rome became entangled in the crime. Merchants who sold luxurious goods knew exactly where the sudden fortunes of senatorial families came from. Income traced back to payments for silence and participation. Priests offered blessings for unions everyone knew had been forced. Poets penned flowery verses that turned state-sanctioned horrors into mythic glories. The official histories never recorded what the human bodies in the palace lived through, but those bodies told their own stories. Scars formed like a private alphabet of pain. Bellies swelled with pregnancies. Women tried to hide beneath layered garments. Faces stopped smiling. The facial muscles of joy atrophied from years of disuse. There was Valeria, the daughter of a senator. Her home once smelled of parchment and olive oil, her days filled with tutors, laughter, and the small luxury of being certain the world was safe. When the summons came, her mother tried to read meaning into the handwriting, too neat to be cruel, too formal to be kind. The palace messenger waited at the door, expression carved from obedience. Valeria was taken before sunset. The house stayed open all night, as if leaving the door ajar might invite her voice back. Weeks turned to months. The city moved on. Rome always does. When she finally returned, she did not scream or cry or speak. She simply walked past her father, eyes lowered, lips pressed together like a sealed envelope. She no longer greeted the household gods. She did not ask for food. She just sat by the atrium pool, fingers tracing the surface of the water until it stilled. At first, they thought she'd lost her voice. The family called physicians, good ones, men with gold seals and clean hands. They examined her throat, her lungs, her pulse. Everything worked. "She can speak," one doctor said, adjusting his rings. "She simply doesn't." It sounded clinical, almost harmless, but there was something colder behind it. She hadn't lost her voice. She had lost the language to describe what she endured. Words had become useless currency. Silence spread around her like fog. Servants whispered less. Her mother prayed louder, as if sound itself could force the girl back into the world. Nothing worked. The priests called it possession. The doctors called it trauma. Rome called it divine mystery, the easiest name for things it doesn't want to understand. Valeria became a presence more than a person. She drifted through rooms like a ghost, still deciding where to haunt. When she looked at people, they looked away, not out of cruelty, but recognition. In her eyes, they saw a mirror of the fate awaiting them: submission, survival, and then a long, careful silence. The other victims avoided her. Her quiet frightened them. It was too pure, too final, like the sound after thunder when you realize the storm is still above you. Caligula's obsessions evolved into ritualized cruelties. He took perverse satisfaction in making mothers watch damage done to their daughters, then reversing roles to force mothers into the very acts inflicted on their children, all while narrating the scene as though reciting poetry. This was not random cruelty. It was a warped doctrine. By destroying motherly love, childhood innocence, and paternal honor, he believed he was unmaking the moral foundations that had held Rome together. In his mind, he was simply updating the old myths. Gods who violated mortals were relics legitimizing his deeds. Zeus disguised himself as beasts. Caligula made the same violence bureaucratic. Attempts to resist were desperate and almost always fatal. Some women stole poison from palace gardens or elsewhere and swallowed it before they could be taken. Others disfigured themselves with knives or by burning their faces, hoping to render themselves useless to the system. But imperial physicians were skilled in restoring life and appearance. Many suicides were reversed and returned to the spectacle, often punished with extra public humiliations to deter others. Those deemed spoiled by mutilation were not spared either. Caligula declared that beauty was irrelevant to divine service, and sometimes used disfigured victims as part of the spectacle, arguing that ugliness made the ritual more pure. There was, in short, no true escape. Those who tried to flee were hunted down by informants and the imperial secret police, dragged back for exemplary reprisals that often involved their whole family. The imperial archive swelled with entries, thousands upon thousands of records, each more detailed than the last. Every violation had a code, a category, a subcategory. There were forms to be filled, protocols to be followed, hierarchies to be obeyed. The bookkeeping of atrocity became as exacting as the ledgers of taxes and censuses. Caligula sometimes showcased the ledger itself as an instrument of terror. He would read selections aloud in the Senate, selecting names and entries at random, forcing fathers and husbands to hear the clinical descriptions of what had been done to their wives and daughters. Julia, wife of Marcus Antonius. 4 hours. 6 participants. Pregnancy confirmed. Public disgrace was part of the sentence. The emperor was creating collective memory of the trauma, making sure Rome would never forget what absolute power could do. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's elite protectors, were not bystanders. It wasn't an awakening of compassion so much as fury at his own debasement. On the night of January 24th, 41 CE, a final brutal ceremony was staged. One Caligula intended as the apex of his public pageants. Wives of senators were pitted against gladiators in an auction-like competition. Numbers called out like livestock. 20, 30, 40. Bodies moved like automatons, fatigued into submission. It was the last spectacle. The next day, as Caligula moved, through an underground passage toward the theatre, Chaerea and a group of Praetorian conspirators ambushed him. They stabbed him repeatedly, dozens of wounds, including a deliberate strike to the genitals, a symbolic reversal of the emperor's humiliations. The irony was bitter. The same men who had helped enable the system were the ones who ended the man at its center. Caligula's wife, Melonia Sasonia, was murdered shortly afterwards. His young daughter, Julia Drusilla, barely more than a child, was also killed. The conspirators intended to wipe out the dynasty entirely. Yet even with the emperor gone, the damage remained. The records, the pregnancies, the scars, the memories, those could not be erased by blades. The new emperor, Claudius, declared a damnatio memoriae. Statues were toppled, inscriptions were chiseled away, coins bearing Caligula's likeness were melted down. Official memory was censored, but paper and people remembered. The torches fade now. The marble halls grow still. You can almost hear the last echo die beneath the stone. The scent of oil, of incense, of power gone stale. It lingers, like the aftertaste of a dream you can't quite shake. Somewhere, deep inside that ancient palace, the air still hums with what Rome chose to forget. A soft rustle of parchment, a voice calling itself divine. A silence that learned to outlive its God. And yet, here you are, far from that marble darkness, breathing in the quiet of your own room. The world outside hums faintly, steady and alive. History closes its heavy doors, but its whispers always find their way through the cracks. If tonight's story stayed with you, let it rest a while. Then share it, so it may wander again, like the echoes of old Rome, finding new ears in the dark. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, not for noise, but for more quiet journeys like this one. Close your eyes now. Let the past sleep. Let the night breathe. Goodbye, and we will meet again.